Natchez Trace Parkway. This documentary is about a section of the Natchez Trace Parkway. The Trace is an ancient trail used by the earliest Americans and travelers up until the early part of the 19th century. It must, in most of the documentaries, the travelers had used the waterways to travel in and across this great land. But for some who only had a short distance to travel, say maybe just to have commerce with a neighboring tribe, or for those who didn't have a sailing or a rowable boat for going up the mighty Mississippi, that good old river, the Trace was their highway. Of the many historical points about the Trace, the one we find very interesting is that it connects many eastern and earthen mounds with which were used by the different tribes as burial and temple sites. The Emerald Mound is the second largest in the U.S. We'll be covering it in a second part to this. And the Far Mounds, which you'll find we visited in this documentary, are being the largest, most important archaeological sites in the Mid-South. Some of these areas around the Far site are as old as 2500 BC. That's 2,500 years before Christ. People lived in and around the Far site. We had a great deal of fun and in pleasure doing this documentary for you, and I want to make it very clear that I highly recommend the commercial travel, such as 18-wheelers and so forth, are restricted from this 400-mile national park. Were you aware that we had a 400-mile national park in this great nation? We really do. It's good road. We met people there from England that had rented motorhomes and were traveling from one end of this to the other. And what a time they were having. There are so many things, you that perhaps are even handicapped and you can't climb or walk long distances, the Trace actually takes you to these earthen mounds whereby you can simply sit in your car or step out of it and the mounds are in sight. You will note that as we get into the documentary. It's safe, I think, a real good area in the South. So sit back and enjoy the history and beauty we have captured for you along a section of the Trace, which runs from the Tupelo Visitors Center north to the Bear Creek Mountain. I know you're going to enjoy it, and again, I highly recommend this. So picture yourself, if you would, doing this 400-mile trip. I know you'll enjoy it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are once again on one of the greatest traces. That means a trail, the longest in that great state of Mississippi, and I believe the United States. There's a national park. She's a beauty, and it gives me it's a privilege and a great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Dale Smith. He's chief of the interpreters of this great trail. Share a little bit, and we thank you for having us here and being our host today.
Well, we're glad to have you here.
Thank you very much.
All
Dale.
right. The Natchez Trace Parkway is a part of the National Park system. Back in 1938, the Natchez Trace Parkway was established as a motor road for recreational vehicles with no commercial traffic allowed. Today, the parkway is almost 445 miles long. Most of it has been completed. There is a little bit yet to go up in Tennessee and some down in southern Mississippi. But once completed, the road will be a total of 445 miles long, connecting Natchez, Mississippi with Nashville, Tennessee. Back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the trace was used by thousands of boatmen. These boatmen were settlers from the Ohio River Valley the Tennessee River Valley, up in the north central part of the United States. After the American Revolution, the British lost control of all the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains as far west as the Mississippi River. Also, at that time, Spain continued their dominance of the lands west of the Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast in the Floridas. The new American colonies, the now new United States of America, had quite a population along the eastern seaboard, many of them spread out over the Appalachian Mountains and on into the Mississippi River Valley, into the Ohio River Valley, and into the Tennessee River Valley, where they would farm and set up communities. But for trade purposes, they had to float their trade goods down the Mississippi River, down to the Natchez and New Orleans areas where they had markets for both Europe and also over on the eastern seaboard. These flatboats were built up along the Ohio River, the Tennessee River. They would float down these rivers to Natchez, and there the goods would be sold. The flatboats, unable to get back up the Mississippi River because of the current, and this being before the time of steam power, would be sold for the wood that was in these. And many of the buildings down in southern Mississippi still have some of these pieces of wood in them yet today. The people, we call them the Kaintucks because they came from the Kentucky-Ohio region, would then march home or walk home through the lands of the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indian nations. These pathways that they traveled were quite primitive. They would follow ridges. They would go through swamps. They suffered from heat, cold, rain, snow, biting insects. It was quite an adventure for these people. Many times it would take as much as 4 weeks for them to get back home, up to Nashville and then onward to their homes on north in the Ohio River area. The vagaries of travel slowed quite a few of them down. The Indians would provide shelter for these people. The Indians were still quite friendly to these people, and with their permission, they were allowed to go through their lands. The Indians even provided rest areas for these Kaintuck boatmen on their way back home. They would stay in crude shelters where they would have a roof over their heads at night. They could find a little food and perhaps some provisions for the next day's trip onward. And like I say, that the trip would take about 4 weeks just from Natchez to Nashville. Once they reached Nashville, the trip home was a little bit easier because then they would be in the United States and the roads had been improved from that time, and they found it easier traveling to get back home. The Natchez Trace Parkway today memorializes that historic old trace. But it was because of the Daughters of the American Revolution that we have the Parkway today. It was back in the 1900s that the Daughters of the American Revolution discovered the old Natchez Trace through some articles that had been written. They decided they wanted to memorialize the old Natchez Trace, so they voted to install granite markers in every county of Mississippi through which that old trace ran. This they began back in 1909 with the first marker at Natchez, Mississippi. Now, almost every county in Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee have such a marker memorializing the old trace. The Daughters of the American Revolution got the congressmen interested in this also. And before long, the issue was in Congress, and by 1933, Congress voted $50,000 for a survey to find out exactly where that old trace was. After this study, in 1938, the Natchez Trace Parkway was then established, and work was begun on a motor road to memorialize that old trace. Today, the Natchez Trace Parkway has many facilities along it. You can camp at 3 different campgrounds along the parkway, picnic at many of the picnic areas. There are over a dozen trails that people can get out of their cars and take a short walk on to stretch their legs. Plenty of places for you to see the rural landscape as well as forest. The National Park Service tries to preserve that particular type of scene, to preserve the cultural and natural resources along the parkway. The Parkway was established, as I said before, to provide for recreational driving. To do this, we restrict access rights onto the Parkway so that the flow of traffic can continue unimpeded and uninterrupted. The speed limit on the Parkway is 50 miles per hour, mostly for the safety, enjoyment, and relaxation of the traveling public. By the year 1800, more and more of the Kaintuck boatmen and other people, from itinerant preachers to explorers, were going down the trace, both north and south. They were involved with the Indian nations, the Choctaw and Chickasaw, who gave these people also permission to go through their lands to use the trace. By 1800, the traffic was so heavy on the trace that it was decided that the United States wanted to improve communications with Natchez, then the capital of the Mississippi Territory. But just before that time, the Spanish had controlled the Natchez and New Orleans areas, and indeed they still controlled the New Orleans area. After the Mississippi Territory was established and this traffic was increased along the trace, President Jefferson decided that he wanted to improve these communications with Natchez to gain better control of the Mississippi territories and the lands to the south and west. In so doing, he established a post road that ran from Nashville to Natchez. And in the year 1800, he, after treaties were made with the Choctaws and Chickasaws to allow this, made arrangements with the U.S. Army to come into the Natchez Trace area. It's interesting, at that time, the Natchez Trace was not known as the Natchez Trace. From Nashville south, it was known as the Natchez Road. He authorized the Army to come in to improve the road from the southern boundary of the United States, which was just south of Nashville, where we call the Tennessee Valley Divide today on the Natchez Trace Parkway. From that point on, back in 1800, Colonel Thomas Butler was leading his men of the U.S. Army to improve the road southward. He improved the road and built actually a new road straight south from Nashville down to what is known today as Colbert's Ferry. George Colbert was an Indian chief at that time, and he was given the permit by the U.S. government to build a ferry over the Tennessee River. Thomas Butler improved the road south to that point, and then onward south from there down to the Chickasaw villages, which is in near present-day Tupelo. The trace was built at that time as a road to handle wagons. It was worked on quite a bit, but never totally improved so that a wagon could have gone from Natchez all the way up to Nashville. But it was improved enough to improve the road for post riders and the U.S. Army. In later years, just before the advent of the steamboat, which called an end to the Natchez Trace, because then the boatmen could book passage from Natchez up the Mississippi, up the Ohio River, back home, much easier than they could walk through the Indian lands. But after the, just before the advent of the steamboat, we had the War of 1812. General Andrew Jackson at that time utilized the Natchez Trace on several occasions for his armies to go north and south on the trace. Back in 1813, he sent a contingent of the mounted cavalry under the command of General Coffee south to Natchez, while he accompanied his infantry on flatboats down the Mississippi River to the Natchez area. The expedition was aborted, however. He was not allowed to go on down to the New Orleans area, so he marched all of his men back up the Natchez Trace. And he had quite a few sick men, some men that were in otherwise ill health or injured from accidents, etc. And he helped these men by allowing some of them to ride his own horse. He walked most of the way. And under those conditions, his men later on, remembering that experience, called him Old Hickory. So that's where he got the name Old Hickory. A couple of years later, before the War of 1812 was finished, his services were needed again, and he went on down to New Orleans, and indeed at that time, well, you know, the rest was history. He won the Battle of New Orleans. His men all marched back up the Natchez Trace back home in victory celebration, and were welcomed back in the Nashville area with welcome open arms. That's a little bit about the history of the Natchez Trace. About that time, the Natchez Trace fell into disuse because of other roads, other trails, and the river traffic because of the steamboat going both north and south. Today, many of the segments of Old Trace are still visible. They were hard to find when the trace was surveyed, but they're here. On the trace itself, on the Natchez Trace Parkway, we have 184 short segments of the old trace that we're trying to preserve so that people can see a little bit about what the old trace was back in the early 1800s.
That old river's been rolling since time began. Smooth and slow on top, dangerous and fast underneath. Just like life, forks and currents that come up on you fast. And if you're just a-drifting, they'll carry you downriver to that big ocean, ready or not. And there ain't no stroke in the world that'll get you back up that stream. But they all kept coming anyway, looking for that rainbow, selling furs and flowers, wheat and hides, and hemp and pork, coming down on their flatboats and barges, loaded for bear. Men tougher than wider knots, tougher than buffalo hides. They called them cane tucks, after the valleys they come from. Why, the Declaration of Independence had only been signed about 20 years when they started coming. They float down the river, sell their goods, sell their barges for timber, and start back up the trace toward home. Some on foot, some on horseback. The French call the path a trace from the line of footprints the Choctaws and Chickasaws had left here. Those Indians left more than footprints in the soft soil the wind brought here. For centuries, their blood and bones colored this good earth. And even today, at places like Mangum Mound, where they were buried, servants along with family, or at Emerald Mound, where they held their ceremonies, why, it spreads out over 8 acres. Or at Chickasaw Village, you can still imagine the glow of those Indian campfires. There's a lot of mystery, as well as history, all along the trace. DeSoto, Hernando DeSoto, he camped near here in his search for gold and glory. He was only the first to chase fancy fortune. There were traders and medicine men, peddlers and preachers. And there were ladies, fine ladies, and gentlemen from as far away as Connecticut and as close by as the Carolinas. Land hunger in their eyes. Land hunger. Doomed men and women, and some men and women of destiny. Now, one of the earliest men of destiny was Abe Lincoln's daddy, Tom. After bringing his flatboat downriver, he walked back up the trace to marry Nancy Hanks in 1806. Andy Jackson earned his name, Old Hickory, from his soldiers as they marched along the trail. Years later, Old Hickory was asked what he thought of those cane tucks on the trace. He said he never did meet one who didn't have a rifle, a pack of cards, and a bottle of whiskey. But beneath that tough hickory bark beat the heart of a man who knew how to love. He courted his beautiful Rachel Robards, and in 1791 made her his wife. They honeymooned at Bayou Pierre, and through the years he defended her honor against the scallywags and scandal-mongers who questioned the honor of their union. There were lots of others, too, winding up and down those trails, good and bad, and some really bad, like Little Harv and Sam Mason, while those two would cut your head off with a tomahawk just to steal your horse and saddlebags. But those early pioneers were stubborn. It took more than bandits and bugs and snakes to kill the traffic on the trace. It took the steamboat. And by 1830, the trace had just about died, even though Tom Jefferson had declared it the first national road. People would just naturally rather ride than walk. But not all people. John James Audubon walked it and painted the flowers and birds. And poor old Meriwether Lewis died at Grinder's Stand. It seems strange that after beating his way all the way to the Pacific Ocean, that he should die indoors at a wayside stand on the trace. And if you read the inscription on the broken shaft marking his grave, written by his old friend Tom Jefferson, you begin to get some idea of what the whole thing's about. The trace, the frontier, even the American dream itself. His courage was undaunted. His firmness and perseverance yielded to nothing but impossibilities. Now it's easy. Most of the impossibilities have been taken care of by the National Park Service. There are plenty of signs that lead you all the way from Natchez to where the trace ends, just south of Nashville. And along the way, you can see it all. In the south, there's Los Bluff. And around Natchez, Port Gibson, Antebellum Home, Plantation, and Windsor Ruins, what's left of one of the great homes of the Confederacy. And a ghost town named Rocky Springs that died long after the trace did. Up toward the middle, there's Cypress Swamp. Little mountain nature trail to walk. Bynum Mounds. Tupelo National Battlefield. And picture postcard farming country. The north part of the trace has waterfalls, low rolling mountains, and open pit mine. Cave Springs. And creeks so clear, well, you can see the fish before you catch them. And all along the way, there are picnic tables, footpaths, and bridges. There's Ross Barnett Reservoir and Colbert Park for water recreation, where you can boat, fish, swim, or ski. There's 3 campgrounds a day's drive apart to give you plenty of time to poke around at Ridgeland Craft Center, where craftsmen display their wares. And offer a variety of demonstrations, such as making corn-shuck dolls, and weaving. Or you can see history come alive at Mount Locust, a restored frontier inn. Center, where people still make sorghum molasses every fall, just like they did 100 years ago. It's all here waiting for you. Living history. Adventure. As for myself, I kind of like to get off the Parkway and do a little exploring on my own, back up into the trace. You might ought to try that too. Because walking those quiet, soft foot trails, you just might discover something new about yourself. A private, personal trail you've never explored. I hope you'll spend an extra day or two wandering, looking, taking it all in. Seems to me an extra day might be worth it. Just like that old river, rolling along, heading on down to the sea. Sometimes it's good for us to go with the flow, just like those old flatboatmen. Slow down a little bit. Feel the warm breeze, and look at the flowers, and listen to the birds. Well, hope to see you along the trail. You be careful now. Drive safe, and have a good time.
Well, here at the Natchez Trace Parkway Visitor Center, just north of Tupelo, Mississippi, we have not only the headquarters of the Natchez Trace Parkway, but also a visitor center with museum exhibits showing some of the history of the Natchez Trace, the wildlife of the Natchez Trace, some of the agriculture that's found along the Natchez Trace Parkway, and agriculture that was found along the old Natchez Trace back in the early 1800s. In the history exhibit that we have right here are some of the items that have come from the age of the old Natchez Trace. For instance, on near the bottom we have a pantograph, which was used by surveyors with their mapping to enlarge or reduce maps and other types of drawings. A compass up here was used back in those early days with the surveyor's guide book that we have opened up to one of the pages. And one of the soldiers' canteens. Back in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson ordered the U.S. Army to the old Natchez Road to improve the road so that we could get a little bit better communications with Natchez through the use of U.S. post riders, Thomas Jefferson ordered the Army to the Natchez Road and improved the road from just south of Nashville on southward almost all the way to the Chickasaw villages, which was near what is present-day Tupelo. The flatboat that we have down below here was the type of boat that was used by the Kaintuck boatmen to float trade goods down from the Kentucky-Ohio region, down the Ohio River, on into the Mississippi River, on down to Natchez. The flatboats were not powered. They could only go downstream. They were very heavy, very bulky, and you can imagine the hardships of trying to take one upstream before the advent of steam power. So they floated their trade goods down to the Natchez area, sometimes as far down as New Orleans, where they traded their goods, and then they would walk back from Natchez up to Nashville on what we now today call the Natchez Trace. The flatboats as well as the trade goods were left in Natchez. The flatboats were taken apart and the timbers sold for building purposes in the Natchez area. Then their trek back up the Natchez Trace would take as much as 4 weeks to get back to Nashville. Back to Nashville meant back to the United States through the Indian nations of the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. Well, we'll be approaching one of the segments of Old Trace up here that the National Park Service has preserved. Along the Parkway we have approximately 184 of these segments preserved. None of them are very long. Most of them crisscross the Parkway. The Parkway being 800 feet or less across usually. It's not very wide. The Natchez Trace Parkway is a very, very long but very, very narrow national park. As people would drive along from their cars, they can see markers that designate these segments of Old Trace that are preserved along the Natchez Trace Parkway. The Natchez Trace got its name by about 1830. Back at the turn of the century, around 1800, the Old Trace was then known as the Natchez Trail or Natchez Road by those going south from Nashville. But the Kentuck boatmen who were leaving Natchez and going north would call it the path to the Choctaw Nation. Once they got to the Choctaw Nation, there was the path that connected the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, and once they were north of the Chickasaw nations at near present-day Tupelo, the trail became known as the Chickasaw Trace. But nowhere in those names do we find Natchez Trace. By the time of the War of 1812, when Andrew Jackson marched his army on the trace several times, and particularly some of the people reminiscing the hardships of the 1813 expedition coming back home with their sick and people who had had accidents and people needing ambulatory care on wagons and on horseback, those people remembered back by the 1830s, many years after that hardship, remembering back nostalgically, they began calling it the Natchez.
You can sure tell as the years have gone by how the trail has been washed out by water or footprints.
What has happened, particularly in Mississippi on the Natchez Trace, is that the years have done a lot of wear to the Natchez Trace. The trail itself, as any trail, would start out on the surface. There was no excavation in those days. They'd walk through the woods, over the ridges, and down to the valleys. And because of the thousands of Kentuck boatmen that were doing this, they would add quite a bit of wear to the tread of the trace, or trail. And over those years, and in the ensuing years between the 1800s and present day, we have had a lot of erosion, a lot of rain, and this would further wear those trails down. There are places in southern Mississippi where the trace goes through what we call loess soil, wind-blown glacial sand. It will wear the trail down, and water will wear it away more. People walk over it, wear it away more, on and on and on, till we call those segments sunken traces. And some of those are most famous along the Parkway, and some of the most thrilling to walk in, because you can get down into areas where the trace has been eroded deep into the landscape, as much as 30 feet in places. Here, many segments of the Natchez Trace did remain after the steamboat, after the travel was diverted from what we know as the Natchez Trace to other local county roads in the region. The post riders left what we call the Natchez Trace and selected other routes as more townships, more communities were developed in the region. So the Natchez Trace pretty much was lost to history for many, many years. A few segments were used as local roads and trails, but mostly it was lost in the wilderness and it grew back. Today, much of the trace is lost under agricultural fields off of the Natchez Trace Parkway property. But During the Civil War, there were several segments of Natchez Trace that were used by the armies of both North and South. Here just north of Tupelo, Mississippi, we're walking along a portion of the sunken trace just to our left. And up here on the slope just above that trace, back during the war between the states, 13 unknown Confederate soldiers lost their lives. We don't know whether it was from battle, sickness, or injury. We don't know who they were. We do know that during the Civil War, 13 unknown Confederate soldiers were buried along this location. And yet today we do maintain 13 headstones to these unknown Confederates. The old trace was pretty much lost to history after the 1820s, but even as late as the Civil War, a few segments of the old trace were still in use as local roads, many of these roads being used by the armies of both North and South. And it was here during one of the campaigns, soldiers coming or going had their lives ended in some unknown way. We have Fort Scott up in Kansas, just north of you there a little ways. And this story up there that they tell is quite fascinating too, about Reconstruction and during the war between the states, Northern sympathizers and Southern sympathizers. Quite a lot of intrigue up there. We also have some segments of history dating back previous to the Natchez Trace. Many Indian mounds happen to be located along the Natchez Trace Parkway, and many of these have been excavated so their stories can be revealed through exhibits, through publications, and out on the trace itself. As you drive along the Natchez Trace Parkway, you can stop at many of these Indian mounds where we have exhibits that will explain the story of those particular Indian mounds. The crown and the tomahawk here came from the Chickasaw villages near Tupelo. It was just north of the Bynum Mound area. Many of these people lived here long before the Europeans came to the North American continent. These people, as is evidenced by this crown, traded with other Indian nations both north and south. Some items would come as far away as the Great Lakes or down in the Floridas. So the Indians were not simply isolated groups, but a series of trails, a system of trails would connect many of these Indian villages with each other, many of these Indian nations with each other, so that they did have trade goods from all over the United States, what is now the United States, even before the Europeans came. We're standing at Far Mounds, one of the many archaeological sites along the Natchez Trace Parkway. There are many mound sites along the parkway through the state of Mississippi, this being the largest in area. We're standing in a field of about 90 acres. There are 8 Indian mounds dating back to about the time of Christ. They were built from that time AD 1 to about AD 200. In that range somewhere. We're not sure exactly just when they were built. But the area is spectacular for this series of mounds that have all been excavated, and they've been studied by archaeologists with the National Park Service and with various universities. By the study we can tell approximately when these people lived, what their lifestyle was, and we can interpret these to the general public to give the people of the United States a better idea of their heritage as we can see it here along the Natchez Trace Parkway. The mounds may be the most spectacular part of it, but we do know that besides the mound builders in this area, before them and for many, many years after them, Indians were living in this area. Indians have been living here from about 2500 BC up to the time of the mound builders, and then on beyond it to about 1400 years after the birth of Christ. These mound builders again being the most spectacular, we're just here for a very short time compared to the amount of time that other people lived here both before and after. The farm mounds covering about 90 acres here, size of several football fields, are in amongst land owned by the National Park Service, by the government of the United States, but we lease out this land to local farmers so that they can bale the hay and they can help us out with the maintenance. So as you look out across the field here, you will see a lot of hay that's been baled, and the farmers do pay just a very small fee for a lease arrangement, and they help us out in that way. The Natchez Trace Parkway is known for many things besides the Indian mounds that have been found along the trace. It's known for historic buildings, many interesting trails. We have many campgrounds, picnic areas for the use and enjoyment of the general public. As you drive along the Natchez Trace, look for these areas, most of which are marked with a hanging arrowhead sign. On that hanging arrowhead, you'll see the Post Rider emblem, which is the official emblem of the Natchez Trace Parkway. The Post Rider emblem was chosen because it was in about the year 1800 that President Jefferson designated the Natchez Trace as a post road. And for many years after that, these post riders would run the mail between Natchez and Nashville, about 445 miles.
Could you tell us a little bit about the building down near Natchez, the old building that is staffed there by park personnel?
Yes, the Natchez Trace was earlier a series of Indian trails connecting various Indian nations. The Choctaw Nation in southern Mississippi, the Chickasaw Nation in northern Mississippi and Alabama. As the Kentuck boatmen would either ride their horses or walk back over the Natchez Trace from Natchez up to Nashville, it would take about 4 weeks. Nighttime falls, they want a place to stay. The Indians provided these early so-called motels, stands, or inns along the Natchez Trace. They provided these very primitive huts or shelters so that the Kentuck boatmen could find shelter. They could find food and provisions for the next day. Down at the very southern end of the parkway, just a little bit north of Natchez, is the Mount Locust Inn. This was one of the earlier inns along the Natchez Trace that the Kentuck boatmen would stop at probably after the first day's journey from Natchez. It's still there. The Natchez Trace Parkway has a staff down there that will welcome visitors to the Mount Locust Inn, let you tour through the inn and around the grounds. And there the story of the Natchez Trace, the inns along the trace, and the people who use them are told. We hope that everyone will enjoy the Natchez Trace. It's here for America. It's to preserve a part of the heritage of our great country. And as you drive along, stop often for your own safety, to relax. The Natchez Trace Parkway is 445 miles long, no stop signs. So as you get tired, stop at one of the trails or one of the waysides along here, such as here at Farm Mounds. Learn a little bit about your history of the National Park Service, the history of the state of Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, and the history of our nation, and enjoy.
Well, Mr. Smith, we want to thank you very much for sharing with us and showing us some of our rich heritage. And I know that I've felt real safe all the time we're here because it's well manned, and I know for senior citizens or anyone, they're going to enjoy the trace from Natchez to Nashville. Thank you very much.
Very good. We're glad that you enjoyed it, and we hope that through the program that many more Americans and people around the world will learn of the Natchez Trace and come and enjoy part of this heritage that we're trying to preserve for America.
Well, it's certainly a bit of history from so many subjects, through the mounds, through the old-timers, the Kentucks and so forth, some of the Civil War. You just kind of get it all on this trace. And again, we just thank you so much for sharing with us, and I know you're going to hear from a lot of people.
Very good. We're here to serve.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead. We're standing atop Mound B, which is about 105 feet in diameter by 110. It's 18 feet tall. You're looking across at the Mound C in the far mounds, which is 115 feet in diameter, and it's also 18 feet tall. We're going to sweep over to Mound D, which is 80 by 95, and it's only 12 feet tall. Now, way in the distance there is Mound E. Not very tall, but it's 165 by 175, being 8 feet tall. I want to say a word about this particular mound, Mound E. Artifacts removed on the dig from this Mound E, here among the far mounds, have dated back to as long ago as 1100 BC. I want to say that again. Some of the artifacts removed from this Mound E have been radiocarbon tested back to the year approximately 1100 BC. Now you're talking there about the times of David, long before Christ walked the earth. So we see in this little valley, certainly, along the trace, the Natchez Trace, that people communicated, lived, and were in this area long before the Americas were settled. I stand in awe at times with our history when it would seem that those people who populated, not in small numbers, but in large numbers, are not recorded in history as they should be. Perhaps what I should say is are not brought forward in our history. Because to me, I feel it is extremely important that this history, in as much as it is part of our history, that it be brought forward. The people that migrated through this area would naturally have migrated or could possibly have been in contact with the people as far away as Loudoun County, Tennessee, where we had the Bat Creek stones found, whereby we even had Levitical priests, apparently, that had recorded a message in stone there. And how precious it is when we look back into our history and enjoy that heritage. What was found in Loudoun County, Tennessee? A stone with ancient Hebrew. No errors, with the exception of one that was purposely done to fulfill a particular saying that Judah should always face east, that the Lion of the tribe of Judah, let the voice of God be the poker that draws these firebrands home. That's what the stone stipulates. Those people migrated through this area. It is reported that in the very area that you're observing now, that in the outlying areas, artifacts have been found that date back 2,500 BC. I'm going to say that again. Artifacts in this very area, in the timberlines and so forth, from the villages have been carbon dated back to the year 2,500 BC. That should become an outstanding part of our history. And research, more research need be done, that history be filled in and completed, and that our young people be taught these things, whereby our heritage, some of the richest parts of it, does not die, but that is studied in public schools, even as we discover that is written of Columbus, so-called discovering the Americas. No, Columbus did not discover the Americans. Pre-Columbian residence in our Americas is well established, and we have documented that here from these great far mounds here along the trace, the Natchez Trace, in our great state of Mississippi. I know that you would enjoy visiting this. It's the trace. You have no walking when you drive by the trace. You can pull off just immediately there and observe all this that you now see simply by stepping out of your automobile. And one of the nice things about the trace, there are restroom facilities there. And I know that you'll enjoy this area, and I know that you'll enjoy part of our rich heritage in the Americas.
Here we are at Bear Creek Mound, lying in the narrow fork of Bear and Cedar Creeks. It was intermittently occupied for approximately 8,000 years, from as early as 7,000 BC to around AD 1300. Probably one reason for the latest occupation was that the site lay in one of the main routes of travel between the Tennessee River Valley and the Tombigbee River Valley to the south. Each group that settled here found something exploitable in the local environment. Over the thousands of years during which the area was occupied, the shift in living style gradually changed from a primitive hunting culture to an effective hunting and wild food gathering economy to finally to an agricultural society. When archaeological excavations began in the summer of 1965, the single Mississippian period temple mound built between AD 1000 and AD 1300 was only 4 feet high, mainly due to damage through recent cultivation. The mound was later reconstructed to approximate its original dimensions of 10 to 12 feet high and 100 feet on a side. The mound was built in stages. When one ruler died, the other succeeding him would have another layer of earth added. It is also probable that the site may have been the ceremonial center for other villages or farmsteads in the vicinity, with all contributing to its construction during this time period. The mound period occasionally is culturally related to that of the Emerald Mound near Natchez, which makes it much younger than the Farr Mounds. Archaeological evidence indicated that a house or temple had been built in the final construction stage of the mound. Although several burials were located in the last stages, there were no associated artifacts indicating that once rigid social system with its wealthy ruling class had broken down. A thought that comes to mind are the copper artifacts that were found in the Etowah Temple Mounds in Georgia, in which one artifact had Libyan writing of a style 5th to 6th century BC, which has been interpreted as a disk to give pleasure, a religious artifact of God's men to lead you by the right hand. Also, Dr. Berryfield's documentary, Bronze Age America, where in 1700 BC in Petersboro, Canada, Scandinavians were trading cloth for copper with the Indians. And to find copper artifacts in these ancient burial mounds shows that people traveled from the Great Lakes through the middle of these Americas and down the Natchez Trace to the Gulf of Mexico. This is just one more proof that these Americas have been traveled north to south, east to west, as we have seen writing in stone and artifacts that are evidence of our people's early travels through these United States.
We're here at 20 Mile Bottom, overlooking the bottom here, just this south of the Farr Mounds. And a preacher came through here in 1812, and he left this message. It was Reverend John Johnson. He stopped at Old Factor's stand down here near this bottom, and he wrote this account of bottomland travel. It's been very wet through that area, not up on the trace, but out in the fields. And, quote, "I have this day swam my horse 5 times, bridged 1 creek, forded several others. Besides the swamp we had to wade through. At night we had a shower of rain, took up my usual lodging on the ground in company with several Indians." That was by Reverend John Johnson in the year 1812. You can certainly see that travel was not easy on the trace, but again I want to emphasize why this thoroughfare was called the Trace. It was because ancient travelers traveled, and they traced, the later travelers traced their footsteps. That's the way they spotted the trail, was by tracing the worn paths that dated back to 1000, 1100, and in some cases even 2500 BC. So tracing the footprints, what a fascinating thing it is as we still continue to trace throughout our nation, learning of the heritage that our ancestors have left before us.